Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight's story never left the terminal. It happened entirely at a gate, in the 20 minutes before boarding, and it stayed with me since the day I heard it. This is the story of Gate B-22. Terrence Bailey arrived at Gate B-22 at Charlotte Douglas International 2 hours before his scheduled departure, the way he always did when a trip actually mattered to him. He wore a plain gray sweater, dark jeans, scuffed work boots he hadn't bothered replacing before the trip because comfort mattered more than appearance for a 5-hour travel day. A worn leather duffel sat at his feet, zipped carefully, packed with more precision than most of his luggage ever got. He was flying to Sacramento for his daughter Maya's college graduation, a Saturday morning ceremony he'd been planning around for 4 months, ever since she'd called him crying with joy to tell him she'd made the dean's list her final semester and would be walking across that stage with honors. Terrence had raised Maya alone since she was 7, working double shifts at a warehouse distribution center most of her childhood, so she'd never have to think twice about whether college was possible. Watching her graduate wasn't just a nice event to him, it was the entire reason he'd worked as hard as he had for 2 decades. He checked his boarding pass twice against the gate display, more out of habit than uncertainty, and found a seat near the window to wait. He didn't take out his phone right away. He sat quietly, the duffel bag between his feet, one hand resting on it lightly, the way a person rests a hand on something they don't want jostled. Inside that bag, folded with more care than anything else he owned, was Maya's graduation gown. Not his own, hers. She'd left it at his apartment the week before during a visit, worried about wrinkling it in her own cramped, dorm-adjacent apartment before the ceremony, and had asked him, half joking, to be her personal gown chauffeur for the trip. He'd laughed and agreed without hesitation, and had spent the better part of an evening researching the correct way to fold academic robes so they wouldn't crease before the big day. The gate agent working Terrence's flight that afternoon was a woman named Patricia Voss, mid-50s, 22 years with the airline, the kind of seniority that came with real authority over gate decisions and, in Patricia's case, a set of instincts she trusted more than she probably should have. She'd noticed Terrence almost as soon as he sat down, not because he'd done anything, because something about him, the stillness maybe, or the way he kept one hand near his bag, had registered in her mind as worth watching. She couldn't have articulated exactly why in that moment. She would be asked to try, later, and would find that she couldn't. Boarding began 40 minutes later. Patricia called zones in order, first class, then priority, then general boarding by row. Terrence, seated in zone 3, waited for his turn, watching the line move steadily, his duffel now over one shoulder. When his zone was called, he stepped into line, handed over his boarding pass, and waited for the familiar beep of the scanner. It didn't come. Patricia held his pass a beat longer than necessary, glancing between it and Terrence's face, then at his bag. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step to the side for a moment. Is there a problem with my ticket?" "Just a routine check," Patricia said, though nothing in her tone suggested routine. She keyed her radio, speaking low enough that Terrence couldn't fully hear, though he caught fragments. Possible security concern. Gate B-22. Need a supervisor. A small knot of passengers behind him in line began watching, the particular attention people pay when a boarding process suddenly stops moving. A woman in her 30s, headphones around her neck, glanced up from her phone. A retired couple exchanged a look. "Ma'am," Terrence said, keeping his voice level, "can you tell me specifically what the concern is? My ticket's valid. I checked in 3 hours ago. I have some concerns about your demeanor and the way you've been monitoring your bag," Patricia said. "It's my responsibility to flag anything that seems out of the ordinary before boarding." Terrence felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite anger yet, more a familiar, weary recognition of a pattern he'd lived through more times in his life than he cared to count. "I've been sitting quietly at the gate for 40 minutes reading emails on my phone. I have a bag with something valuable in it that I've been careful with. That's the entirety of what you've observed. I'd like a supervisor to review this before you board," Patricia said. "It's standard procedure when there's a flagged concern." It wasn't standard procedure. Terrence didn't know that yet, not with certainty, though the instinct sat in his gut anyway, the specific instinct of someone who has been profiled enough times to recognize the shape of it, even when the person doing it insists otherwise. A gate supervisor named Ray Delgado arrived within a few minutes, a heavy-set man in his 40s who listened to Patricia's account with a neutral expression that gave little away. He turned to Terrence. "Sir, I understand there's some concern about your bag. I'd like to ask you to open it for a visual inspection. You're not obligated to, but I want to let you know that declining may result in denied boarding today." The line behind Terrence had stopped moving entirely now. More passengers had turned to watch, phones beginning to come out. Not aggressively, just the reflexive documentation instinct of people who sensed they were witnessing something. Terrence looked at Ray, then at Patricia, weighing the actual choice in front of him, a choice that wasn't really much of a choice at all, not if he wanted any chance of making it to Sacramento in time for his daughter's ceremony the next morning. "Fine," he said quietly. "Open it." He knelt, unzipped the duffel with careful, deliberate movements, the same care he'd have shown regardless of the audience, because the care wasn't performance. It was simply how he'd been treating this particular bag for 3 days. Ray crouched beside him, peering in. Patricia stood a few feet back, arms crossed. Terrence reached in first, before Ray could, lifting out the folded garment with both hands the way you'd lift something fragile. A deep navy graduation gown, carefully pressed, a gold honor cord tucked inside the folds, and beneath it, wrapped separately in tissue paper, a graduation cap with a tassel still pinned neatly to one side. The line went quiet, genuinely quiet, in a way that carried differently than the earlier murmuring had. "That's my daughter's," Terrence said, his voice catching slightly for the first time since the whole thing had started. "She's graduating tomorrow morning. Dean's List. First in our family to finish college. She asked me to carry it so it wouldn't wrinkle in her apartment." He looked up at Ray, then at Patricia. "This is what you thought was a security concern." Ray Delgado stood up slowly, his expression shifting from procedural neutrality into something closer to discomfort. He looked at the gown still in Terrence's hands, at the honor cord, at the careful tissue paper around the cap. "Sir," Ray said, "I apologize for the inconvenience." "That's not an apology," Terrence said, still kneeling beside his open bag, still holding his daughter's gown like something precious, because it was. "An apology explains what actually happened. You looked at me sitting quietly at a gate with my hand on my bag, and you decided that was suspicious. Not because of anything I did, because of how I looked doing it. Nobody in line said anything, but nobody looked away either." Patricia, still standing a few feet back, opened her mouth as if to defend the decision, then seemed to think better of it, her arms uncrossing slowly. A woman near the front of the line, the one with the headphones around her neck, whose name was Diane Reyes, a flight attendant herself, deadheading home on her day off, stepped forward without quite deciding to, the way people sometimes do when something in them refuses to stay silent any longer. "I watched this whole thing happen," Diane said, addressing Ray directly. "He didn't do anything. He sat quietly. He answered every question. You searched a man's bag in front of 40 strangers because he was black and calm, and it turned out he was carrying his daughter's graduation gown like it was made of glass." She turned to Terrence. "I'm sorry this happened to you, sir. Truly." Terrence nodded once, carefully folding the gown back into its protective layer of tissue, his hands steady even though something in his chest had gone tight and raw. The captain for the flight, a woman named Elena Ortiz, had been standing near the jet bridge door, completing her pre-flight paperwork when the commotion started, close enough to hear most of it. She'd flown for the airline for 16 years, and in that time had developed a low tolerance for exactly this kind of scene playing out in front of a boarding line. She approached, badge visible, 4 gold stripes on her sleeve catching the gate lighting. "What's going on here?" Ray straightened. "Captain, we had a flagged concern about a passenger's demeanor. It's been resolved. The bag contained personal items. Nothing concerning." "I heard most of it from over there," Elena said, her voice even but carrying an edge Ray recognized immediately as trouble for him specifically. "You searched this man's bag in front of the entire boarding line based on him sitting quietly with his hand near his own luggage. Is that an accurate summary?" Ray hesitated. "There were other factors." "Name one," Elena said. Silence. She turned to Terrence, her expression softening considerably. "Sir, I am genuinely sorry this happened to you before boarding my aircraft. What's your name?" "Terrence Bailey." "Mr. Bailey, I'd like you to board first, ahead of the rest of the line, and I'd like to personally make sure your gown gets stowed somewhere it won't be crushed. Would that be all right?" Terrence looked at her for a long moment, something in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. "That would mean a lot. Thank you, Captain." Elena turned back to Ray and Patricia, her voice dropping into something quieter but no less firm. "I want a full incident report on my desk before this flight lands. Both your names on it. And I want it accurate, not sanitized." She paused. "Patricia, walk with me for a moment." She led Patricia a few steps away from the gate, out of easy earshot of the remaining line, though several passengers still watched the exchange with open curiosity. "I've flown with a lot of gate agents over 16 years, Elena said quietly. "I know the difference between someone doing their job and someone acting on a feeling they never bothered to question. I don't know what made you flag that man. I don't need you to explain it to me. But you're going to sit with it, and the airline is going to review it, and I'd strongly suggest you spend some real time thinking about what exactly registered as suspicious about a father protecting his daughter's graduation gown." Patricia's composure finally cracked slightly, her eyes dropping. I didn't mean— I believe you didn't consciously mean anything, Elena said. That's exactly the problem worth sitting with. Terrence boarded first, exactly as promised, walking down the jet bridge alone, while the rest of the line waited behind him. A flight attendant met him at the aircraft door and personally cleared a space in the forward closet for the gown, hanging it with careful attention, smoothing the fabric flat. As the rest of the passengers boarded, several of them made a point of catching Terrence's eye as they passed his row. Small nods, one man briefly resting a hand on his shoulder without a word, Diane Reyes stopping to say she hoped his daughter had an incredible day tomorrow. Somewhere over Kansas, 3 hours into the flight, Elena came back through the cabin during a lull and crouched briefly beside Terrence's aisle seat. How's the gown holding up? She asked, a small smile in it now. Perfect, Terrence said. Not a wrinkle. Good. She studied him for a moment. For what it's worth, Mr. Bailey, I've been flying a long time, and I've seen plenty of nervous, jumpy, genuinely suspicious people move through gates. You weren't any of those things. You were just a father trying to keep something safe. Terrence looked out the window at the clouds passing beneath the wing, thinking about his daughter, about the 4 months of planning, about the 20 years before that. That's all I've ever really been trying to do, he said quietly. Keep something safe long enough to get it where it needed to go. The next morning, Terrence sat in the third row of a packed auditorium in Sacramento, the gown perfectly pressed and hanging on Maya just as carefully as he'd carried it across the country. When her name was called, Maya Bailey, Bachelor of Science with honors, he stood up before he could stop himself, clapping until his hands ached, tears he didn't bother hiding running freely down his face. He never mentioned the gate incident to Maya that weekend. It wasn't hers to carry, not on a day that belonged entirely to her. But 3 weeks later, back home, he received a formal letter from the airline, a written apology, a travel credit he had no real interest in using, and a note at the bottom, handwritten, from Captain Elena Ortiz personally. Mr. Bailey, I hope Maya's day was everything you both worked for. Some things are worth protecting exactly as carefully as you protected that gown. Safe travels always. E.O. He kept the letter folded in his desk drawer, alongside a photograph from the ceremony. Maya in her cap and gown, mid-laugh, sunlight catching the gold honor cord around her neck. That's the story of Gate B-22. Terrence Bailey never raised his voice once through the whole ordeal. He didn't need to. He just kept protecting the one thing that actually mattered, the way he'd been protecting his daughter's future for 20 years, long before anyone at that gate ever laid eyes on him. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. But dignity, it turns out, was never something anyone had the right to search out of a person in the first place. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's always another flight, and always someone worth looking a little closer at before you decide what you think you see.